Hi, welcome back to the ANCAP Entrepreneur Network, where we're building businesses for a free society. I've got Peter G. Klein on the Skype with me on a video Skype session. Peter is Senior Scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. He has some other credits to his title, but that's the one that impresses me the most. Peter is his area of study is entrepreneurship and business management in general. He's done a lot of work, a lot of research and presentations, and I believe also teaches on entrepreneurship within an Austrian economics tradition. So I was very pleased that Peter agreed to come on the line and discuss with us entrepreneurship and how we can use that to bring more liberty into our lives.
Hi, Mark. How are you this morning?
Hey, Peter. How's it going?
It's going great. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Okay. You're looking good, and I think we're going out. It'll be about 5 seconds, and I'll see it on the big screen, and I'll be able to tell what everybody else is doing. So, one thing I realized just before we get started with the questions, with your introduction, how much of your work is the work I'm familiar with, your research into entrepreneurship and sort of the fundamental ideas of Austrian economics, and how much of your work is teaching MBA programs, perhaps more traditional entrepreneurship things?
But that's a good question. I mean, my main teaching appointment at the University of Missouri is in teaching courses in management, managerial economics, business strategy, and entrepreneurship. And it depends on the level of the course. In our introductory courses, we're teaching some very basic skills, some basic business skills, a new venture planning, and so on, some marketing skills. In the more advanced classes, where we're discussing more the kind of conceptual foundations of entrepreneurship, the impact of entrepreneurship in society, and so on, then we get more into some of the issues that we'll be discussing today, specifically the role of the entrepreneur in the Austrian conception of the market. But, I have a somewhat broad teaching portfolio. So at the undergraduate, MBA, and even at the doctoral level, the extent to which we get into these deeper issues really depends on the context of the course.
Interesting.
But
one of the things I'm interested in following up is just what the differences are between sort of the traditional ways that entrepreneurship is discussed in business schools and what new insights Austrian economics brings to it.
Absolutely, and we can certainly get into that during the discussion today. I'd be happy to talk about that.
Okay, well, give us a quick background of your research, your recent book, the sort of things you've written about, and one of the things I'd like to do during the course of this interview is get to a good, solid definition of what an entrepreneur is, according to the Austrian School of Economics. So give us a start on that path, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, I've been interested in the economics of entrepreneurship for, 20 years or so, since I did my own graduate work. I've been involved in the Austrian movement since my graduate school days, was a fellow of the Mises Institute back in the late 80s and early 90s, got the opportunity to work with Murray Rothbard. I served as his assistant with the Journal of Libertarian Studies, and had the opportunity to sort of learn at the feet of some of the great Austrian economists. At the same time, my formal graduate training at the University of California was in a more mainstream area of applied economics, business economics, and organizational economics. I studied with Berkeley professor Oliver Williamson, who was one of the 2 Nobel laureates in economics in 2009. And he's famous for developing a particular approach to understanding business organizations and how entrepreneurs, though he doesn't use the language of entrepreneurship, but how entrepreneurs come up with sort of creative organizational solutions to important business problems. He famously studied vertical integration and corporate diversification, issues of firm scope, organizational design from an economic efficiency perspective. So I did my formal training under him, and then I've taught in a few different business schools, economics departments, applied econ departments at sort of more or less mainstream universities, teaching business economics, managerial economics, and more recently entrepreneurship. Have had the opportunity to work with some very good graduate students, particularly in the last few years, who are working explicitly on Austrian topics. And at the University of Missouri, we have a small Austrian study group. We did an Austrian PhD seminar in the fall. We have a human action reading group going on now. So we have quite a cluster of young people who are interested in not only sort of conventional approaches to entrepreneurship and strategic management and organizational design, but also the Austrian tradition, broader issues associated with the free market, and so on. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying almost all of my career has been about blending or incorporating insights from the Austrians, in particular Mises and Rothbard, with insights from modern organizational economics and entrepreneurship studies, people like Williamson, Ronald Coase, and other more mainstream figures who have worked to develop kind of a theory of business strategy, business design, business organization, management structure, and so on.
Well, nice. I avoided the whole field of economics, at least macroeconomics, until I learned about the Austrians. So I'm somewhat ignorant of the mainstream's ideas of economy, perhaps blissfully so. But
yeah, I tend to macroeconomics as well to the extent that I can, but it's been more difficult in the last few years. But you asked about entrepreneurship and
yes,
sort of how I view the entrepreneur and how the mainstream business school literature and economics literature and policymakers, how they view the entrepreneur, and I can comment a little bit on that.
Yes,
as well.
That. Because in the mainstream, the word entrepreneur gets sort of touted around as a cure-all for whatever ills there are, and people use the word in different ways. So tell us about the mainstream view and how the Austrian view is more specific.
Right. Well, it's a great question. There's a lot more discussion of entrepreneurship within the mainstream, among academics, among policymakers, people at think tanks, the World Bank. Everybody thinks that entrepreneurship is important, that we ought to have more of it, that it's somehow associated with economic growth and prosperity. But I think the mainstream literature is really all over the map in trying to conceive what entrepreneurship is and why it might matter. Let me say a word or two about kind of mainstream economics first, and then a word or two about mainstream management theory, or what gets taught in business schools and MBA programs. Entrepreneurship was an important part of economic theory from its origins in the 18th century through the middle of the 20th century. Not only the Austrians, Karl Menger and his associates, but many other important economists from different schools of thought all theorized about the role of the entrepreneur in society, the importance of entrepreneurship, the function performed by the entrepreneur, and so on. But then the entrepreneur pretty much disappeared from mainstream economics by the 1950s, 1960s, as neoclassical economics became more mathematical and more focused on sort of static equilibrium analysis, developing models in which there is no room for the entrepreneur, no need for an entrepreneur, no role for the entrepreneur to play. So mainstream economists had, and continue to this day, to have a little bit of sort of cognitive dissonance. They sort of they think that entrepreneurship must be something important because they hear about it in everyday discourse, and business people talk about it, and the media talks about it, and so on. But they really don't know how to handle it because they can't model it mathematically. They cannot insert it into some kind of a formal, physics-style model of the economy for fine-tuning and so on. So they mostly, it's sort of like, the elephant in the room. They polite. You avoid talking about it in polite company among mainstream economists, Now, in business schools, students are interested in it, deans are interested in it, donors are interested in it, employers are interested in it. So every business school nowadays has an entrepreneurship program and entrepreneurship courses and maybe an entrepreneurship center, an entrepreneurship major or minor. But the management literature is very confused about what entrepreneurship is. It's sort of a generic catch-all word that includes things like creativity and being thinking outside the box. Sometimes it's used in a very narrow way to apply only to self-employment and new venture formation. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with innovation and venture funding. Sometimes it's used just to mean high growth rather than low growth companies. In some of my writings, I've distinguished these different views a couple of different ways. One way I like to think about it, or find it useful to think about, is entrepreneurship an outcome, a phenomenon that we can observe and count and measure, like the number of IPOs, the number of startup companies, the percent of the population that's self-employed, and so on? Or is entrepreneurship a way of thinking or a way of behaving about many different problems, like being innovative, being alert, being creative, making good decisions? Those are things that can apply to a lot of different phenomena, small companies and big companies, new companies and old companies, self-employed and employed people, and so on. So what I find most useful, Mark, is the definition that comes out of Ludwig von Mises, and also the important American economist Frank Knight. And that's the idea that entrepreneurship is ultimately about making decisions about resources under conditions of uncertainty. Right? So Mises emphasizes that all human action takes place under conditions of uncertainty, meaning we never know exactly whether our actions are going to lead to the outcomes that we desire. So, for example, all of your listeners right now have allocated, maybe they had an out-of-pocket expense for travel or to buy a new webcam or computer time, or maybe it's just the value of their time, the opportunity cost of their time, but they've made an investment in participating in this conference today. And they did it because they thought they would learn something, they would make friends, they would do some networking, make some contacts, get some ideas that would make their business better, maybe just personal enjoyment and satisfaction. But the point is, they didn't know for sure exactly how big those benefits would be. They took a risk, in other words. Yeah. So they invested some resources up front, their time, their expertise, their reputation, maybe some dollars, in anticipation of some reward that would come later. And they had to make kind of a judgment call about whether the reward would be big enough, whether they thought it would be big enough to justify the expenditure. Mises points out that that's what human action is all about, as opposed to kind of, robotic action or instinct, where people do things because, for reasons they can't really put their finger on. Mises says, no, human action is purposeful, it's goal-oriented, and if there's uncertainty, as there is in the real world, we don't know for sure that the means we employ will lead to the ends that we desire. And we all bear a little bit of uncertainty in our everyday decisions about what to do and where to go and so on. So the way Mises describes the behavior of entrepreneurs is they are the agents in society that are responsible for making decisions about how to allocate scarce resources, particularly factors of production, land, machines, capital goods, and so on. They use these resources and control these resources and combine these resources in different ways in anticipation of satisfying consumers' wants in the future, and thus earning some monetary revenue that they hope will cover their costs. So Mises has in mind a very active role, a controlling role, a sort of decisive role. The word that I've used in my own research, a word that's borrowed from Frank Knight, Mises doesn't use this word, but I think this is what he means. I have used the word judgment, that entrepreneurship is about judgmental decision-making, which means decision making that is not routine, that is not mechanical, that is not predictable in the sense that certain outcomes we can predict with some in a fairly accurate way. If you spin a roulette wheel, you can predict that a certain number will come up, 1 out of 32 of the time or whatever. But human action, judgmental decision making, is about how we employ resources, physical resources, and our time and reputation and so on, in anticipation of achieving goals, business outcomes more narrowly, the results of which cannot be predicted with certainty. So business owners, business founders, and all of us who own and actively manage and control productive resources are acting as entrepreneurs. Mises says in Human Action that entrepreneurship is, quote, the driving force of the market economy, the driving force of the market. So mainstream economists with their mathematical models of art populated by artificial humans following programmed routines, there's no market in a real sense in those models. There's nothing
no human decision.
There's no human decision, there's no human action, there's no judgment, there's no entrepreneurship. In the real world, resource allocation doesn't just happen by itself. It doesn't happen automatically. It takes purposeful human action. It takes entrepreneurial judgment or business judgment to make the world go round and to make the market work. And that's why entrepreneurship is so important. It's at the heart of what a market economy is and does.
Now, there was a part of that description, I'm not sure if it's an inherent one or if it's sort of a typical way that entrepreneurs might act. You talked about decision-making and judgment. It could be the case that I'm trying to decide what to do with my day tomorrow, whether I work on one project or another. I stay on the farm, so there's no shortage of projects. There's 100 different ones, and so I might decide which one to spend my time on. But that's sort of a judgment of the resources that are directly under my control, and pretty much I'm the one that's affected by the outcome of it. I think I saw in Human Action, Mises referred to this as autistic decisions. It was the first time I'd heard the word outside of the emotional disorder. So now, is that entrepreneurial, or does the entrepreneur have to suggest things for other people, for other individuals to decide whether to accept or deny? Is that communication an inherent part of the definition of an entrepreneur, or is it just happen to be that way often?
Right. Well, you can think of entrepreneurship at different levels, and in kind of a broad sense and a narrow sense. And I mean, look, it's true, according to Mises' definition, that Robinson Crusoe on an island, as long as he faces some uncertainty about how to allocate his labor and his coconuts and his fishing rod or whatever, I mean, he is behaving as an entrepreneur in a sense, but that's not a particularly important form of entrepreneurship because, as you point out, if he's only one person on an island, his actions don't have much of an impact on economic activity in the market because he's isolated from the market. He's participating in what Mises describes, as you point out, as autistic exchange. But the kind of entrepreneurship that we're really interested in, the type of entrepreneurship that is the driving force of the market, as Mises puts it, is that entrepreneurship that takes place within a market context. Right, so what we're really talking about in practical terms is business decision-making, where you purchase factors of production on the market, right? The business person enters into markets for factors, for labor, for land, for raw materials, for machines, for expertise, and so on, purchases those factors in market transactions, organizes them, rearranges them, uses them, puts them into production, and then produces stuff. Food and TVs and automobiles and consulting services and legal services and whatever, and then goes and sells those things on the market to consumers. So the entrepreneurship that drives the market is judgmental decision-making in a social context right? In the act of buying and selling. So really what economics is all about is trying to explain markets, what markets do, how markets work, where do market prices come from, and it's the actions of entrepreneurs in input markets and in output markets that determine those prices. Now, so that's, Mark, one of the differences between how Austrians view things and how mainstream economists view things. For mainstream economists, prices are just sort of a mathematical, a price is a mathematical datum that is determined exogenous. Yeah, and, human beings maybe respond to prices in some way. For Austrian economists, prices are the outcome of human action, the outcome of bargaining, the outcome of judgmental decision-making between people who want resources, people who have resources, willing to exchange them, and so on. That's what determines prices. It's entrepreneurship.
That's right, and of course, I remember my wife said that when she was growing up in Holland, they taught her in economics that the government was necessary to intervene in the market whenever there was an imbalance between supply and demand to create that balance. And of course that sort of assumes away why wouldn't they balance? Why can't they naturally find a balance without coercion?
No, absolutely.
So that's
absolutely right.
I mean,
sure.
The most attractive part of Austrian economics is that it describes things as interactions between individuals without that coercive force. And is that built into the definition of an entrepreneur? Must an entrepreneur only behave within the market? I've heard some other researchers talk about political entrepreneurs who have new ideas for ways to grow government bureaucracies. Right. Is it within the Austrian tradition to refer to people like that as an entrepreneur?
I mean, not as commonly, but to some extent, this is a semantic issue. I mean, usually when we're talking about entrepreneurship, as in the discussion we're having today, we have in mind what Mises might have called catalactic entrepreneurship. Mises used some unfamiliar terminology. One of the words he used was catalactics to describe the science of voluntary exchange. So Mises does have analysis in human action. Rothbard has analysis in Power and Market about interventionism. And, human beings still act in an interventionist society. They act under socialism, communism, interventionism, whatever. And we can analyze that. So if we want to restrict our definition of entrepreneurship to human action or judgmental decision-making, within a market context, that's what most of our analysis would do. But, I mean, look, a prisoner in a prison camp has to act entrepreneurial in a sense, right? I mean, he has to make decisions about what to do and which guards to bribe and whether to try to escape today or tomorrow. And, I mean, that's human action, right? I mean, that's purposeful decision-making. It can be described using the language of judgment or entrepreneurial alertness or creativity or innovation, if we like, as long as we recognize that now we've moved beyond what Mises calls the catalactic setting, and now we're talking about human action, kind of in a non-market sense. As you say, there is some research on policy entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs. I think as long as it's kept in mind that we cannot draw the same kind of welfare conclusions or conclusions about well-being in the non-market realm that we can in the market realm, we're okay. In other words, we can say that purposeful human action, entrepreneurial judgment, entrepreneurial behavior in a market setting makes people better off, right? It creates value, if you like. It makes society better off. But we cannot say that entrepreneurial action in the political sphere necessarily makes us better off, right? I mean, a corrupt dictator finds a creative and innovative new way to exploit people. That's in the interest of the dictator, but it certainly isn't in the interest of other people. So as long as we keep that coercion versus freedom distinction in mind, there might be cases where it would be instructive to use the entrepreneurship metaphor in a non-market setting. I mean, you might also think about so-called social entrepreneurship, right? So there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity in the non-profit, in the voluntary non-profit sector, philanthropists and various do-gooders and so on. I mean, your organization I assume is set up as some kind of a nonprofit. I mean, the Mises Institute is not a catalactic organization in a sense. I mean, it doesn't use coercion. It relies on voluntary contributions from supporters, and it does have some commercial activity, selling books and so on. But the objective of the Mises Institute is not to maximize monetary profit, right? It's to spread ideas. It's to make the world a better place. So certainly, Lou Rockwell is an entrepreneur, and Doug French and Jeff Tucker and the other people who were involved in the creation and ongoing operation of the Mises Institute, they're entrepreneurs in a voluntary market setting. It's just their objective is not to make money, it's to achieve some broader social goals.
That's right. That's one of the nice things about human action. Often, I guess economics gets, it's a bit of a straw man argument, but people complain that, you can't just be interested in simple economic outcomes. You have to be interested in people's deeper motivations. And the nice thing about the Austrian view is it goes right back to that decision making, and it's all fair game as long as we talk about making decisions, and it can be studied as part of economics.
Yeah. Mark, I might say a word or two about how entrepreneurship is typically taught in business schools. Because I want to be careful. I think there's a lot of value in entrepreneurship programs, but there are a lot of problems with them as well. Most entrepreneurship programs at universities do not take this sort of broader, sort of functionally entrepreneurship as a function kind of perspective that I'm outlining. Rather, they look at entrepreneurship as purely the phenomenon of startup companies. And so they teach students how to write business plans, how to make elevator pitches, how to do new products marketing, how to exercise leadership in small teams, and so on. In other words, the typical entrepreneurship student is presumably an undergrad or maybe an adult who wants to start a new venture and needs some help assembling resources and starting new ventures. And that's
to know how to fill in his small business development grant for the government.
Yeah, that's the dark side of it. But I mean, obviously, there's nothing wrong with teaching those skills, but that's a slightly limiting. It's a somewhat limiting conceptualization of what entrepreneurship is. In other words, you teach the guy how to start his business, but once he's actually had his IPO, then it's not entrepreneurship anymore, and it's just management, and we use a completely different set of theories and skills. I think that's not true. But the other problem is, to the extent, look, professors really can't teach these things. I mean, there's some things that you can learn in school. You can learn accounting, and you can learn a little bit of basic finance and how to compute discounted cash flows and all that kind of stuff. But, entrepreneurship, as we've been describing it, is ultimately about making these kinds of judgments about future market conditions, and that is not something that's ultimately teachable, right? Certainly academics, professors at college and universities, they can't teach that. I mean, if I could teach people how to be entrepreneurs, well, A, I certainly wouldn't do it on the cheap, and B, I would just be an entrepreneur, right? Those who can't and those who can't teach. That's the old story. But I think where business schools have gone wrong is giving the misleading impression to students that, hey, we can teach you how to make good judgments. We can teach you how to be alert to opportunities, to use the Austrian economist Israel Kirzner's language. We can teach you how to innovate. Business schools can't teach that. Mises, there's a great quote from Human Action. I don't have the quote in front of me. I may not get it exactly right. Mises says something like, entrepreneurs rely on a specific anticipative understanding of the market, and this understanding can neither be learned nor taught. So some of us have a particular faculty for anticipating. That's the word he uses. Having an anticipative understanding of what the future will be like, and that's something that that's sort of an explanatory primary. We cannot explain why some people do it and other people don't. We cannot teach you how to do it. The entrepreneur cannot write down a formal mathematical model of how he did it that can then be transmitted to other people and so on. So, a lot of the literature, especially the practical management literature, the books that you find at Barnes & Noble or, in the business section of the airport bookstore, there's Aristotle's Lessons for Leadership and, Donald Rumsfeld on uncertainty and so on. And, there's lots and lots of books about how to be a great entrepreneur. Most of those books probably aren't worth the cover price. If they teach some basic skills, if they teach basic business skills, or if they explain maybe to policymakers why entrepreneurship is so important and why you should leave it alone, okay, well then they might have some value. But you don't teach a person how to be an entrepreneur. That's not a teachable skill in a business school or from a book.
Well, one of the things I'm interested in studying through the ANCAP Entrepreneur Network is this idea of people bringing about the free society through their business ventures, being able to anticipate exactly what the market needs are for security and for solving all the other problems that has been monopolized by the government, and looking for opportunities to fill those needs in non-coercive ways.
Absolutely.
So from that point of view, I wonder sometimes, is there any other way to change society except through entrepreneurship, except through offering up your idea of what the future should be, hoping that other people react to that and accept it and help you build it, cooperate with you and trade and associate with you? Is that true, or are there other ways besides entrepreneurship to affect society?
Well, I mean, sure, but not in a good way.
Yeah, okay. Right? Consciously determined society, I guess. Tsunamis affect society.
Look, this is kind of the right. Well, this is the classic, another manifestation of the age-old sort of fundamental debate between reliance on, spontaneous market forces and bottom-up organization, as opposed to government planning and sort of conscious, deliberate, top-down organization. And I'm imagining that everybody who's listening to this discussion is already familiar with that and probably is much more sympathetic to the bottom-up approach than the top-down approach. But I think that's exactly why, look, one of the reasons that entrepreneurship is so important is precisely because we cannot model, predict, or sort of formalize what will be the results of entrepreneurial creativity. We let entrepreneurs loose. We try to provide, an institutional setting in which entrepreneurs can do their thing, and we wait and see what marvels they will come up with. I mean, you think of a lot of analogies. Go back in time 10 years or 20 years and try to predict what internet technology would be like, and what how search technology would work, or what telecom would be like. And of course, nobody could have come close to getting it right. Murray Rothbard used to use the following example. He said he was trying to explain why advocates of the free market should not take it upon themselves to have to explain to critics exactly how everything would work in a free society. So, if you're going to talk about private law, private justice, private crime, private punishment, adjudication, arbitration, and so on, and the critic says, well, if you had a free market for judicial services, how many firms would there be? What prices would they charge? Would they be big? Would they be small? Rothbard said, look, it's not up to the advocate of the free society to come up with precise answers for that. The burden of proof is not on us to explain exactly what the details would be like. He said, Rothbard said, imagine you lived in a society in which the government had nationalized the shoe industry since the beginning of time. And, no one had ever known a system other than the one in which the government owned all the shoe factories and produced all the shoes and distributed the shoes and so on. And now some crazy libertarian comes along and says, gee, I think we ought to privatize the shoe business. I think the free market could produce shoes. And the critic says, what? Well, okay, fine. If you think that would work, tell me how many shoe stores would there be? How many shoe companies? What sizes would be offered? What colors would the shoes be? How many different styles of shoes would there be? And so on. Well, of course, nobody could answer those questions, but so what? I mean, we would be confident. The proper response would be, well, I don't know exactly what outcome entrepreneurs would, what outcomes entrepreneurs would create, but I know that by relying on, human creativity, unleashing the power of entrepreneurship in the shoe sector, it would lead to outcomes that are vastly superior to that of the government shoe industry because of what we know theoretically about entrepreneurs and markets. So I would say the same thing in terms of the kinds of issues that you're talking about, Mark. So, no, we don't know exactly what private adjudication would look like. There are lots of different models that are out there. But if we allowed entrepreneurship to work, if we unleashed the creative power of the human mind in that area, we can be pretty confident that some very creative solutions, ones that you and I can't even imagine right now, would come along. And it's the fact that there's competition among entrepreneurs who are seeking to earn profits by offering better products and services to consumers than their rivals. I mean, we can be pretty confident that the outcome of that process will be socially desirable, even though we can't predict exactly what the landscape would look like.
Well, that fits in nicely with something I'd like to follow up on. Just before I make my comment, though, I've got a chat window going here, and I'm going to encourage people, if they have any questions for you before we finish off in a few minutes, to put them in the chat window. But one of the things that you said is sort of what I'm hoping that the ANCAP Entrepreneur Network can do, rather than try and determine what might happen with society by looking at it from above and saying, this is how all the pieces are fit. Instead, we will be individual nodes within that network. We will each be taking a small piece of one of those problems and saying, here's my opinion of how I think it would work, and here's how I will organize the resources under my control and offer it to others in the market. And then we see what the market response is. We interact in the market, we see if we're successful or not, and we actually become that creative force down inside the market that are making those minute changes that will all add up to getting us closer and closer to what we don't know now what it will end up looking at, but will eventually be a more free society.
Absolutely. And entrepreneurship is limited only by the artificial constraints that the state and other coercive institutions might put on it. And recognizing that it's entrepreneurship that ultimately drives the market and ultimately leads to consumer well-being. If we could get policymakers to understand that, we might be a lot closer to achieving the kind of goals that most of us share. I mean, what's happened in the policy world is, government agencies and the World Bank and so on, they talk a lot about entrepreneurship, and they're starting to get it maybe a little bit, but they still tend to define entrepreneurship far too narrowly. In other words, they mean, letting people start small companies, like the